Welcome to our third video, continuing with the 3D viewport and looking at the navigation menu as well as the footer. In the navigational menu, you can expand or close the different sections. I'm going to open up the transformation section. In this, I can see location, rotation, scale, and dimensions. And you notice that they all have X, Y, and Z designations, referring X, of course, to the red line. The green line here is Y, and the blue line is Z. There's also a little icon in the corner that shows you those labelings as well, so that way you can associate them very easily. If I want to, for instance, say location, if I want to move my box one blender unit, I could just type in 1 and hit enter, and it has now moved one blender unit. This is a 2x2 cube, 2x2x2. And so if I want to offset it one blender unit in each direction, I could do that. I could also click and drag with the left mouse button in that Windows section. If I want to, I can lock the sections so that they don't move. So here, if I go, now I only see the green arrow and the blue arrow. I can click on the arrows to move it as well. But I can't do the X direction because I locked it. That can be handy if you need to make sure you don't move something other than the way you want. Similarly with rotation, if I click, I can actually drag, so I can make this rotate around the X-axis, rotate around the Y-axis, rotate around the Z-axis. If I want to, on any of these, I can right-click on it, and I have some different options here. We'll get into those things later, but I can say reset all values to default, and there reset all that section to default. If I right-click in here, reset all to default values. Now it puts it right back in the center. For scale, if I move my scale in different ways, I can adjust that here as well. I can also right-click on this, and again, I could say reset all to default values. There's also some other things that we can do with scale we'll do later on, where we can reset the scale if this is our actual size we want for something. We probably want the computer to recognize it as 1 for each of these instead of 4, 1.55, and 1. That way it works much, much better with different shaders and things like that we might apply to the shapes. Dimensions, similar, except for the dimensions is really apart from scale, even though I see those two changing. If I reset my scale to 1, it doesn't reset the dimensions. The dimensions stay in relation to what the actual scene is, or the size of the scene. I'm going to move a little bit further down, and I'm going to skip the grease pencil. And actually, I could even uncheck that box if I wanted to. I'm going to go to View, and here I can see a few different options. I could turn on render border so that when I'm looking through the camera view, 0, it'll help me kind of identify where my edges and stuff are, although everything's grayed out around it, so I can see that pretty easy. I can also do lock camera to view, where in this case, as I move my camera now, I can see it change, but maybe since this is actually representing what would be rendered, maybe I want that larger. If I unclick lock camera to view, zoom in a little bit, I can click lock camera to view again, and now I can see what the camera is looking at in a little bit larger perspective. I'm going to go ahead and close view down for the moment. 3D cursor. The 3D cursor is an essential part of Blender, where that's that little ring that has the red and white banding. And the 3D cursor, I'm going to go ahead and exit camera view there. The 3D cursor actually helps identify where objects should be. Also, in some cases, where they should move from. We're going to get in a little later video where we explore some more options as we edit and transition shapes. But if I move these, if I click and move them back and forth, I can see the 3D cursor move. In the viewport, whenever I click with my left mouse button, it'll reset where that 3D cursor is. Problem is, in 3D space, it's a little bit hard to tell where that's lined up. So if I rotate this around, that's actually roughly where I was thinking it would be. But that one wasn't, where I thought it looked more like it was in this quadrant there. If I move it, it's closer to me. I can do Shift S and go to where it says cursor to center to recenter that in the middle. I could type zeros here. I could even do right click and say reset single to default value, or I could say reset all to default value if I have all these different and I want them all to be zeroed out. When I add objects, wherever that 3D cursor is, that's where it will add them. And in some cases, that will control how things scale or move. If I go to where it says item, here I can rename my cube. Maybe I want to rename the cube Bob, or maybe we want to rename the cube to table. If I'm making a table in the scene, in the outliner, whatever this name is, in fact, let's switch to our multiple views here, multiple editors. Here I can see that this item now is represented as table, and that way I can select them really easily from the editor, and it's easier to find the different elements that you have in a scene. I'm going to go and expand this again by doing Shift Space. Minimize that. In display, most of these will kind of leave alone, but there's just some different options and stuff that it has here. Again, this controls your grid, so like I could change how many grid items that I want. I could actually take away the grid floor if I wanted to. I could make the grid lines in different dimensions, so that's the actual verticals and stuff that I have. Here I can see it going all the way up and down and stuff too for my Z axis. Actually, it's just the perspective I was looking at. And then I can also, in display, do toggled quad view, so I can see it there. And I can click on that again to toggle out of that view. And so this has some different options that you can play and mess with, but in general, I generally don't touch display myself. Shading, again, not something that I'm going to do a lot of things with in some projects. It's been useful to change some of the ways that these look and see. Also, we have motion tracking, again, not something that I really mess around with. Background images, we will use that for some projects that we do, where we might want to be able to add a plane in here to be able to build a model off of. So for instance, maybe you wanted to make a model of a race car or an airplane or submarine. I've actually done a submarine before with this, to put in the layout from the side and maybe a cross section and use those to help adjust your model to see where things go. We'll get into that in some later tutorials as well. And then this is talking about how the transforms and things, what mode it is in, and I'm just going to leave it in global. All of these will make things act just a little bit differently based on some take into account the position and rotation of the object as they do things. In this case, global means that everything in the scene is all referenced from this parent grid right here. It's all looking at that, and that's its reference. I'm going to go ahead and exit that menu. Oops, wrong one. And I'm going to go down to the header bar down here. Again, this can change a little bit based on whatever mode we're in. Right now we're in object mode, and I'm going to get into edit mode a little bit later, but these all have different things. They also show the shortcuts next to them. So for instance, this one has toggle quad view, Control-Alt-Q, fast way to get to that. And so you can see some of those pretty easy. There's some select options, more appear when you're in edit mode. There's add options. So these are some different types of things that I can add. And so we can add different mesh shapes. And then objects, again, some different things relating to those. This is a way of selecting between the modes. There's some keyboard shortcuts that we can use instead that are a little bit faster, but sometimes to get to some of the different modes, it's just easier to go down here and select. This is how we see things in the viewport. Right now, I'm in what's called Blender Render. And as we're working with things, we'll usually use Cycles Render. And if you didn't notice, the shading changed a little bit on the object there. And we can actually use this to switch how we see things. So this is rendered mode. Why? I also have materials, texture, solid. If I have a really complex scene, sometimes I might use wireframe mode to see things a little bit better. With a rectangular solid, which is what we have here, it won't look much different for like bounding box. But if I have a sphere inside, in fact, let's go to add. I'm going to go to mesh, put in a UV sphere. Now I have two objects. And if I go to where it says bounding box, I see these both as boxes and can see it that way. Shortcut for switching between those, if I hit Z, I go into wireframe, Z again, I go into solid, Shift Z, I go into rendered mode, and then I can just hit Z to toggle out of that, or Shift Z to toggle back and forth between shaded and rendered. Over here, this is how we tell it to orient how things move. So if I change this, this is from the middle of whatever is selected. So for instance, if I select both those objects, I hit R for rotate, it'll rotate around the combined center of those two objects. Whereas if I change this, so if I select the mode here, and I do individual origins, and I hit R, both of them rotate separately. If I go into this one and do 3D cursor, wherever my 3D cursor is, that's where it'll rotate around. So if I left click over here and I hit R, now it's rotating around that spot instead. Shift S will let me put the 3D cursor right back in the center, cursor to center. And I'm going to go back to here. I'm going to change this so that it's back to medium point. That's the default. Here I can toggle the different kinds of arrows. So I can take away the tool that lets me see the directions there. If I click on this curve, this is the rotation tool, where I can use that and grab the lines and actually just rotate it on those segments. I can also do, this is scale, so I can move those like that. Global, and this is similar to what I was talking about in the navigation menu. In this case, changing these can help a lot with some of the ways that I modify or change things. I'm going to switch back to this arrow, the arrows, the move tool, and I'm going to go to local, and you'll notice that this has directions that are based on the orientation of the shape now. So if I use this one, I can use this to go up and down, or side to side based on wherever the shape is in space. If I use global, then it's referencing the map here. The arrows match up with my arrows in the viewport. We're going to go ahead and stop with that. We're going to cover the rest of this in the next video, and we'll also get into some of the editing features.